My name is Lauren. I'm 30 years old and I'm a labor rights attorney. I've spent most of my life working quietly behind the scenes, fighting for people who have no one else on their side. Funny thing is, I never imagined I'd need to fight for myself, and certainly not against my own family. It happened on a Sunday evening, a family dinner, one of those traditional overcooked roast, cloth napkin, silver cutlery kind of dinners, the kind that looks warm and happy on the outside, while everything simmers just beneath the surface. There were candles, wine glasses clinking, polite small talk. And then came his voice. My father. He leaned back in his chair, swirling his glass of red wine with that smug little smile he always wears when Eric, my older brother, is the center of attention. The room had been buzzing about Eric's latest promotion, some fancy new title at a real estate firm. I wasn't listening. I was too busy calculating, in my head, how much I'd need to budget for next month's mortgage payment. Their mortgage payment. That's when he said it. Without warning, without provocation, like he'd just been waiting for the perfect moment to twist the knife. You'll never be as good as your brother, Lauren. The whole table paused, like a scene frozen mid-breath. Someone's fork clinked against a plate. My aunt looked down at her lap, embarrassed. My cousin blinked like she'd misheard him, but I didn't flinch. I didn't cry. I didn't laugh it off. Instead, I reached into my purse, pulled out the envelope I had prepared earlier that day, and placed it deliberately on the linen-covered table between the gravy boat and the floral centerpiece. All eyes turned to me. Then ask him, I said, my voice calm but razor-sharp, to pay your bills. Silence. The kind of silence that hits like a thunderclap. My father blinked, confused, annoyed, but I wasn't done. Your medical bills, your mortgage, the loan you took last fall, the credit card debt you forgot to mention. Tell Eric to pay it all, since he's the one who's so much better than me. I could feel my mother stiffen across the table. Eric's wife looked mortified. Eric himself was too stunned to speak. I sat back in my chair, calm, controlled. But inside me, there was a quiet storm finally breaking. For years, I had been the one holding everything together. Quietly, without thanks, without acknowledgement. And now, after years of shouldering their burdens, covering their expenses, losing sleep over their unpaid bills, my father had looked me in the eye and told me I would never measure up to the son who never paid a dime. So no, I didn't yell, I didn't break, I didn't make a scene. I told the truth, out loud. And the truth? The truth made the room go silent. That was the moment when everything shifted. But if you think it started there, at that table with that single sentence, you're wrong. It started long before that. Before the bills. Before the loans. Before I was even old enough to understand what favoritism was. It started when I was 6 years old. Back when I still believed that being a good daughter meant trying harder. That love had to be earned. That being quiet was the same thing as being strong. I was wrong. Let me take you back. Let me show you how a little girl raised in the shadow of her golden brother became the woman who finally stood up and said, enough. When I was 6, I thought my brother Eric could do magic. Not the kind with cards or rabbits, real magic. The kind where every room lit up when he walked in. Adults laughed louder, leaned in closer, and their faces changed like he carried some secret they all wanted to be part of. He was 2 years older than me, and somehow galaxies ahead. At school, his name preceded me. I was always introduced as Eric's little sister. Teachers smiled wider when they saw my last name, but their smiles faltered once they met me. I wasn't Eric. Eric had been reading chapter books in kindergarten. I was still working on sounding out words. He won a spelling bee in 3rd grade. I cried through mine in 5th. But I tried. God, I tried. Every night I stayed up with flashcards. I read aloud under a blanket with a flashlight after lights out. I begged my mom to quiz me on times tables until I could recite them in my sleep. Still, it was never enough. I remember one night in 2nd grade, I came home clutching a math test with a 92 circled in bright red. I was so proud. It was the highest grade I'd gotten all year. I waited until after dinner, then gently slid the paper across the table to my dad like it was treasure. He glanced at it, sipped his tea, and said, "Eric never studied for math. He just understood it." That was it. No good job. No, I'm proud of you. Just a reminder that whatever I did, Eric had already done it. Better. It didn't matter how hard I worked. His talent always outshined my effort. At first, I thought I just needed to be more like him. So I tried baseball, because Eric was on the all-star team. I hated the sound of the bat cracking, but I practiced until my hands blistered. My dad came to one game, I struck out twice and walked home in silence. Eric hit a home run that same week. There were balloons and a pizza party. I tried piano next. Eric didn't play, so I thought maybe this could be mine. But when I stumbled through my first recital, my mom whispered afterward, "You were brave, sweetie, but maybe next time we pick something that comes more naturally to you." She didn't say it to hurt me, but her voice held that soft, gentle pity that stung worse than anger. Mom never raised her voice, never compared us openly. But her silence, that was louder than words. At parent-teacher nights, she'd spend 20 minutes in Eric's classroom. Teachers laughed with her, praised him like he was bound for greatness. When it was my turn, she sat stiffly in the tiny chair, nodding as my teacher politely said I was diligent, quiet, and average. We never stopped for ice cream after. Just drove home in silence. That's what I remember most from those years. Silence. The silence when I cried alone in the bathroom after getting picked last for gym class. The silence when I stood on stage holding a third-place ribbon for my science project, watching Eric take first for his. The silence when I asked if they were coming to my art show and they told me Eric had a debate tournament that day. He always had something more important. And I was always there. In photos, I'm the one slightly out of frame, holding the balloon string, standing just behind the spotlight. There's one photo from my 10th birthday. I'm mid-blow on the candles, eyes closed. Behind me, my dad is already turning to Eric, clapping him on the shoulder for winning his spelling bee that morning. That was the day I learned to stop expecting the moment to be mine. I began shrinking myself, quieting my voice, lowering my expectations. If I couldn't be Eric, then maybe I could be helpful, useful, easy. So I became the peacekeeper, the helper, the daughter who never asked for too much. I did the dishes without being told. I offered to help my mom fold laundry. I learned to disappear in conversations and nod when everyone talked about Eric's achievements. And when I did get tired, when the resentment started bubbling up, I shoved it down with a smile. Because deep down, I still believed that if I worked hard enough, if I became good enough, they'd see me. They'd see Lauren, not Eric's sister, not the less gifted one. Just me. But the years kept rolling, and nothing changed. Eric became the golden boy of our school. Class president, honor roll, national merit finalist. I became the girl who showed up, did her homework, and faded into the background. And no matter how hard I tried, I stayed in his shadow. I used to think shadows were cool places, safe, quiet, but I've learned they're also cold, lonely. And the longer you live in someone else's, the more you start to believe that's all you deserve. Looking back, I wish someone had told me that the sun shines in more than one direction, but no one did. So I kept chasing their light, never realizing I had my own. If you ever walked into my parents' living room, you'd think they only had one child. The walls were a shrine, a carefully curated museum of Eric's life. Rows of gold-frame photos, plaques, and glass cases displaying trophies that shimmered under soft track lighting. There was Eric in his varsity baseball uniform, bat raised mid-swing. Eric shaking hands with the mayor after winning the state debate championship. Eric and his wife beaming in front of a beachfront resort on their honeymoon, her diamond ring catching the light perfectly. Every corner had a memory, and every memory had his name on it. I was there too, somewhere. You just had to squint. There was a photo of me and Eric at our grandparents' anniversary. I'm off to the left. Slightly out of focus, mid-blink, it's the only picture of me on that wall. And even then, it wasn't really about me. Once, when I was 17, I won first place in a statewide art competition. Oil on canvas, an abstract piece inspired by workers' rights and generational labor. My teacher cried when she saw it. I came home glowing. I held the blue ribbon in one hand, the letter from the judges in the other, practically vibrating with pride. I walked into the kitchen where my dad was reading the newspaper and sipping coffee. I laid the ribbon on the counter like it was gold. He looked up, gave a small nod, and said, "That's interesting, but have you thought about picking a more stable career path, something practical?" He didn't even ask to see the painting. That was the moment I stopped showing him things. It wasn't just the photo wall. It was birthdays, holidays, graduations. Every celebration had the same pattern. Eric's accomplishments at the center, the rest of us orbiting around him like dim satellites. Christmas was always at our house, and Mom insisted on displaying the yearly highlights on a bulletin board in the foyer. Eric's section was overflowing. A printout of his latest Forbes feature, a wedding invitation from one of his high-profile clients, a photo of him giving a speech at a tech conference. Mine? A postcard I sent from a legal aid conference in St. Louis, thumbtacked in the bottom corner, half covered by a garland. No one asked about the cases I worked on. The tenants I'd helped avoid eviction, the workers whose unpaid wages I recovered. They weren't the kind of stories you could put in a frame. Once, my aunt asked me during Thanksgiving, "So, Lauren, are you still doing that charity law thing?" She said it with a smile, but I heard what she meant. Still doing that small thing? That less than thing? Eric walked in 5 minutes later with a bottle of French wine, and suddenly the room lit up. I watched my father take the bottle with both hands, reading the label like scripture. Imported? Nice. That's class. You've always had great taste, son. I brought homemade cranberry sauce. Nobody touched it. It wasn't about the wine or the sauce. It was about what those things symbolized. Status, validation, success you could see and measure. And in my family's eyes, my victories were invisible. I once asked my mom, gently, if we could hang my painting in the hallway, the one that won the state fair. She hesitated, then said, "It might clash with the new wallpaper." The wallpaper was beige, so I kept the painting in my apartment, leaned against the wall in the hallway outside my bedroom. It never made it into a frame. But Eric's old baseball glove, it had a shadow box. I don't think they meant to be cruel. They didn't even realize they were doing it. Favoritism doesn't always come with fireworks. It drips in like a leaky faucet. Quiet, persistent, unrelenting. Over time, you learn to stay thirsty. I stopped bringing up wins. I stopped correcting them when they got the details of my work wrong. I stopped asking them to come to things. Art shows, speaking panels, legal forms, because I already knew the answer. "We'd love to, sweetie, but Eric's in town this weekend." "Oh, that's the same night as Eric's fundraiser dinner." "Eric said you wouldn't mind?" I did. I minded deeply. But I smiled. I stayed helpful. I kept showing up. Because some part of me still believed that if I just kept being good, quiet, reliable, useful, they'd notice. Not out of guilt, but out of pride. They never did. And somewhere along the way, I stopped needing them to. Not because I stopped caring, but because I got tired of waiting for a moment that was never going to come. You can only be a ghost in your own family for so long before you start haunting yourself. I decided to become a lawyer when I was 13, not because I wanted prestige, not because I thought it would impress anyone, but because of something I saw on the news. A group of workers, immigrants, had been cheated out of their wages by a restaurant chain. They spoke barely any English. The owner denied everything, and when asked who would represent them, the reporter said, "No one yet." Something about that stuck with me. The way no one seemed to care. The way the story ended with a shrug. I remember thinking, someone has to care. So I did. I studied hard through high school, applied for scholarships, got into a solid public university with a reputable law program, Nothing flashy, but it taught you how to fight for people, how to listen, how to build a case that would stand even when the system tried to crush it. When I got my acceptance letter to law school, I brought it home in a manila envelope, expecting maybe, just maybe, a glimmer of pride. My dad read it once, folded it back into the envelope and said, "That's fine. But why didn't you try for Yale? That's where Eric went, you know?" Of course I knew. I could recite Eric's resume backward. Yale undergraduate, Yale Law, editor of the Law Review, summer internship at a global corporate firm. By the time I graduated, Eric was already working with hedge funds, real estate conglomerates, and foreign investors. My dad told people he was shaping cities. When neighbors asked about me, he'd say, "Lauren's doing something in nonprofit law. She works with tenants or something like that." Then he'd pivot. "But Eric, now that's a real success story." He said it with pride, like he'd built Eric with his own 2 hands. The irony? I was the one who came home every weekend to help mow the lawn when Dad threw out his back. I was the one who stayed with Mom during her minor surgery while Eric was wine tasting in Napa. But none of that made it into the introductions. They called me the other one more than once. Eric was the investment. I was the afterthought. Still, I kept going. I joined a labor justice nonprofit after graduation. Small office, old furniture, good people. We took on big landlords, wage theft cases, and unfair dismissal suits. We made real change. But to my father, it was a starter job. "Don't get too comfortable there, Lauren. You won't build a future working for scraps." I tried to explain how we helped a janitor win back 3 years of unpaid overtime, how we prevented a family of 5 from being evicted days before Christmas. He smiled vaguely and asked if Eric's firm was still hiring. That was the kind of support I got. Then came the roof. It was a spring storm, torn shingles, water damage. The whole thing needed replacement. My dad called me in a rush. Mom sounded panicked in the background. Insurance would take weeks. The bank was closed. Eric was abroad. They just needed a temporary bridge, he said. I didn't think twice. I wired him $5,000 that afternoon. No contract, no timeline, no hesitation. I didn't ask for it back, not because I didn't need it, but because part of me still believed that if I kept being the dependable one, eventually, that would matter. Months passed. No mention of repayment. I let it go. Then one day I overheard him on the phone with a family friend, someone I hadn't seen in years. He was bragging about Eric's new condo downtown. Paid for it in cash. That's a real man for you, always taking care of himself. The friend asked about me. I heard Dad chuckle. Lauren's still doing her little advocacy thing. She's got a good heart, but, Eric's the one pulling real weight. That's when I realized in his eyes, I wasn't a lawyer. I was a hobbyist with a law degree. Never mind the 80-hour weeks. Never mind the clients I'd saved from bankruptcy. Never mind the sacrifice. In that moment, I didn't feel like his daughter. I felt like a placeholder, a footnote. He never paid the money back. And I never asked again. Because I understood something then that I hadn't wanted to admit before. To some parents, love is conditional. Value is measured in flash, not substance. In headlines, not impact. And no matter how much you give, time, effort, money, years, they'll always be more impressed by the son who sends a birthday card with a wine bottle than the daughter who holds the roof over their heads quite literally when it starts to fall. It started with a stomachache, nothing dramatic, just a lingering discomfort that Mom brushed off for weeks. She said it was stress or something she ate, but eventually the pain got bad enough that Dad took her to the urgent care clinic. They ran some tests, recommended a minor outpatient procedure. Nothing life-threatening, but still necessary. Insurance wouldn't cover all of it. The estimate came out to around $1,800 up front. I was in court when Dad called me. His voice was rushed, a little breathless. "Hey, your mom's fine. Nothing major, but we've hit a small snag with the insurance. And Eric's in Europe on business, so he can't help right now. Think you could spot us for this one? Just until next week." I didn't even blink. "Of course," I said. I wired the money that evening, skipped my usual grocery run, and pushed off my own dental appointment. It wasn't a big deal, just a temporary thing, but that's the trick with temporary. It always has a way of becoming permanent. That first payment turned into a habit. A few months later, the car broke down. Dad's truck. Another $900 bridge loan. Then the heating system went out in January. $1,300. And the dental procedure Mom had postponed for years? I covered that too. Each time, the reason was the same. Eric's got a lot on his plate right now. You know how it is. I did know. I knew that a lot on his plate meant he was vacationing in Tulum, or hosting wine tastings, or posing in a custom-tailored suit on LinkedIn. I also knew that no one ever asked Eric. They just assumed he was too busy, too important, too far removed. But me, I was close, available, reliable. Lauren, the good daughter. Lauren, who always picks up the phone. Lauren, who never makes them feel guilty for needing help. They never said it, but I heard the unspoken praise behind the requests. You're the dependable one. And I wore that title like armor. Until I realized it was actually a leash, because somewhere between paying for the hospital copay and covering the broken water heater, I became the family contingency plan. I was no longer just their daughter. I was their safety net. And no one ever said thank you. Not once. Instead, they minimized it. It's not that much. You'd spend more on a new phone. It's just until we get things sorted. Sorted never came. I didn't keep a formal tally. I didn't want to. But I remembered every receipt, not because of the dollars, but because of what they cost me. They cost me time. Staying late at the office, picking up pro bono hours I couldn't afford, just to justify my salary. They cost me sleep. Lying awake wondering how much longer I could keep pulling rabbits out of hats. They cost me choices. Passing on travel, skipping dinners out, delaying basic things like fixing my brakes or buying a new laptop. Still, I stayed silent. Because I thought that's what love looked like. Quiet sacrifice. Unseen effort. Consistent reliability. I thought if I kept showing up, they'd finally see me. But they didn't. One day, my dad was showing a neighbor around the house. They paused in front of the garage, brand new doors I'd helped fund, and I heard him say, Eric always told us to invest in the exterior. He was right. Adds real value, not a word about me. Not a mention that I had paid half. Not even a glance in my direction. That was when I realized they were never going to give me credit for saving the ship. They were too busy polishing the sails Eric had gifted them from afar. I wasn't the favorite. I was the fallback, the one they leaned on but never looked at, the one who gave and gave and gave until I started losing pieces of myself. Not out of resentment, but out of exhaustion. Because being the good one doesn't mean being valued. Sometimes it just means being used more quietly. By the time I turned 28, my life had become a carefully balanced equation. I had a full-time job at the nonprofit. I took on freelance research projects in the evenings. I squeezed in client consultations on weekends. And in between, I was still helping my parents, covering copays, utilities, even their unexpected property tax bill when they forgot it was due. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't loud, but it worked. Barely. Meanwhile, Eric was in Paris. He'd just closed some massive deal, and to celebrate, he and his wife flew first class for a week of restoration. That was the word he used in the Instagram caption, next to a photo of them kissing in front of the Eiffel Tower, her designer heels, his gold watch, the champagne flutes they were holding. It all shimmered in a way my life never had. I scrolled past it on my 10-minute lunch break while eating a microwaved burrito in the break room. I didn't feel jealousy. I felt small, like everything I did was shrinking beside his highlight reel. A week later, my parents announced they were hosting a party to celebrate Eric and his wife's 5th wedding anniversary. Not their own anniversary, theirs. They've built such a beautiful life, Mom said, eyes glowing. We want to honor that. Of course, I offered to help. I booked the florist, picked up the catering samples, created the digital invites, and when the bakery deposit came in $300 over budget, I quietly covered the difference without mentioning it. I even took a day off work to decorate the backyard. Hung lights, ironed linens, polished the wine glasses. I told myself it was fine. I didn't need the spotlight. I just wanted everyone to feel comfortable. That was enough until it wasn't. The party was elegant, warm, and nauseatingly perfect. White tablecloths fluttered in the breeze. A string quartet played soft jazz. Guests arrived in cocktail attire, murmuring compliments and sipping rosé. I stood near the buffet table, refilling platters and folding napkins into triangles. Then came the introductions. My dad was walking a family friend around the yard, a man I hadn't seen since high school. When they reached me, I straightened, expecting, something. "This is Lauren," Dad said with a brief gesture. "She works at some small legal office downtown. She helped organize today." Then he turned back to the guest and started raving about Eric's latest investment property. That was it. Some small legal office. I wasn't even worth the name of my organization. Wasn't even worth a pause. I could feel heat crawl up my neck. My hands stiffened, still holding a folded napkin. That day, I had given more than 8 hours of manual labor, $300 of my own money, and weeks of coordination, to be dismissed like a part-time intern. No one noticed I wasn't eating, that I hadn't sat down once. They were too busy fawning over the anniversary slideshow projected onto the side of the house, Paris, Venice, Dubai. A slow-motion clip of Eric helping his wife out of a private boat made my aunt gasp. "Like a movie star," she whispered. I stood near the trash bins, collecting used plates. When it was time for speeches, my mom got teary. "We are just so proud," she said, "to see what Eric and Madison have built. Such love, such stability, such success. It gives us hope for the future." Then she raised her glass. I didn't join in, not because I wasn't happy for them, but because at that moment I realized something painful. My family didn't just overlook me. They actively edited me out. I was invisible until they needed a favor, needed a deposit, needed a ride, needed someone to clean up. But when it came time to celebrate, I was no one. And yet, I had helped build the very table they were raising their glasses over. Literally. After the guests left and the lanterns dimmed, I stayed behind to help clean. My mother sat on the patio chair, sighing contentedly. "Wasn't that just magical?" she said. "You did such a great job with the napkins. Everyone said the folding looked so professional." She didn't ask how much I had spent, didn't ask if I was tired. She just said, "Eric's wife looked stunning tonight, didn't she? He's so lucky to have found someone like that." I nodded, then kept scrubbing wine stains from the tablecloth. That night, as I drove home in silence, I did the math. I had contributed $487 to that party, lost a vacation day, and spent hours laboring in a dress that didn't quite fit because I couldn't afford a new one. All so I could be called someone who works at a small legal office. That's when I realized the price of being the good one wasn't just emotional. It was financial, physical, mental. And the worst part? They weren't even aware of what they were taking, because when you give silently, people assume it costs you nothing, but it always costs something, and I was starting to run out. There was a time when I believed exhaustion was noble, that being tired meant you were useful, needed, good. So I wore it like a badge. The late nights, the weekend hours, the side gigs I stacked on top of my already demanding job. After the anniversary party, the bills started stacking too. My parents' heating unit gave out again. The electricity bill had gone unpaid for 2 months, and somehow the home insurance had lapsed without anyone noticing. Dad called me on a Wednesday. "Just a small hiccup. The heating guy won't come unless we put down half. I tried Eric, but he's presenting to the board today. You know how it is." I knew exactly how it was. I transferred $900 that same afternoon. That week I took on 2 extra freelance contracts. drafting tenant agreements for a nonprofit that couldn't afford to pay much. I told myself it was temporary. I'd catch up on rest next weekend. But weekends were where the invoices lived. I spent Saturdays going through spreadsheets, Sundays chasing delayed reimbursements. My phone never stopped buzzing. Venmo requests, emails marked urgent, credit card notifications pinging like alarms. Sleep became optional. Some nights I couldn't fall asleep until 3 a.m., my mind spinning with calculations. Some mornings I woke up already anxious, my jaw clenched so tightly I couldn't eat until noon. I started skipping lunch to save time. My hair thinned. My skin broke out in ways it hadn't since high school. My shoulders ached from hours hunched over a laptop that wheezed every time I opened another tab. I ignored it, because being tired was the cost of being helpful. One evening, after a 12-hour stretch at work, I stopped by my parents' house to drop off a receipt. It was for their auto repair, the one I had covered last week without telling them. I handed Dad the paper, eyes barely open. He looked at me, then at the paper, then back at me. "You look rough," he said flatly. "Maybe try getting more sleep instead of complaining all the time." I blinked, stunned. I hadn't said a word about being tired, but I must have looked it. Hair tied back with a pen, dark circles no concealer could hide. "I'm not complaining," I said quietly. "Just tired." He scoffed. "Eric's been working 16-hour days on this new project, flying back and forth to LA, but you don't hear him moaning about it." I almost laughed. Eric was flying business class to pitch luxury condos. I was fighting to keep tenants from being unlawfully evicted. I was paying for someone else's furnace while microwaving instant noodles at midnight. But sure, let's compare. I didn't say any of that. I just nodded and folded the receipt back into my folder. As I turned to leave, he added, "You've always been a little sensitive. You let stress get to you too easily. Eric knows how to balance. You should ask him how he does it." That one hit harder than I expected, not because I believed it, but because it was so predictable, so automatic. Even now, after everything, he thought Eric had the answers. And me? I was the overwhelmed daughter who just couldn't handle her own life. The irony was brutal. I was handling his life, his bills, his emergencies, and somehow still falling short. That night I cried for the first time in weeks, not the kind of cry that comes with sobbing or shaking, but the quiet kind. The kind that leaves your pillow damp and your chest hollow. I didn't tell anyone. The next day, I got up and went back to work. Then to my second job. Then home to pay more bills that weren't mine. Because even when the recognition never came, the requests always did. And I kept saying yes. I said yes because I thought it made me strong. I said yes because I couldn't bear the thought of them suffering while I had anything left to give. But with every yes, I chipped away at myself. Not visibly, not all at once. But slowly, methodically, like a leak behind drywall. Until one day, I would walk into a room and no longer recognize the woman standing in it. I was becoming someone I didn't plan to be. Not the independent attorney, not the fierce advocate, but the exhausted fixer. The unpaid emotional accountant of a family that couldn't or wouldn't see what I was giving up to keep the lights on. And worst of all, I wasn't even sure they'd notice if I stopped. It was a Tuesday morning when the call came. I was already running late, stuck in traffic behind a delivery truck, rehearsing arguments in my head for a hearing that afternoon. My phone buzzed and I almost ignored it until I saw it was Dad. I answered on speaker. His voice was cheerful at first, casual. "Hey, kiddo, quick thing, we've got an opportunity to refinance the house. Lower interest, better terms. But there's an upfront fee, $3,000, give or take. We need it by Friday to lock it in. Think you could float us?" Just like that. Like he was asking me to pick up milk on the way home. I gripped the steering wheel tighter. The number echoed in my head. 3,000. My checking account had $312 in it. My savings were drained from last month's water damage repairs, and I hadn't even paid my own rent yet. I cleared my throat. "Dad, I can't. I don't have it right now." Silence. Then, what do you mean you don't have it? I mean exactly that. I can't help this time. There was a pause. Then a sharp edge crept into his voice. That's a little selfish, don't you think? After everything we've done for you? I felt my stomach drop. Selfish. That word hit harder than it should have. I'd given them nearly every spare dollar I had for the past 3 years. I'd missed vacations, postponed dentist appointments, and skipped meals to make sure they didn't have to feel the weight of their own emergencies. And now, the one time I said no, I was selfish. I'm sorry, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. But I'm behind on bills. I've been taking side jobs just to keep up. I don't have anything left to give right now. He laughed, short and bitter. Eric's been under a lot more pressure than you. He just flew back from a 12-day stretch in Hong Kong. But he didn't whine about money. He manages. I didn't respond. There was nothing to say. I knew this script by heart. He continued, You've always been the emotional one. Making things harder than they are. You get that from your mother. He hung up. I sat in the car, blinking at the dashboard like it could explain how we'd gotten here. That evening, I came by their house anyway. I brought over groceries. They'd mentioned being low. I figured it was a peace offering, or maybe just habit. The tension in the air was immediate. My mother didn't greet me at the door. She was on the couch, tissues in hand, red-rimmed eyes that she didn't bother hiding. Eric was there too, which was rare. He stood in the kitchen, arms crossed, silent. I placed the bags on the counter and said softly, I heard you needed a few staples. I grabbed some things. My dad didn't look up from his spot near the window. He muttered, We needed support, Lauren. Not groceries. Mom sniffled loudly. I just don't understand. We've always supported you. Always loved you. Why would you turn your back on us now? I turned to her, heart pounding. Loved me? You've loved what I do for you, not who I am. She flinched like I'd slapped her. That's not true. Isn't it? I asked. You love that I say yes, that I fix things. But the one time I say no, I become selfish, ungrateful, difficult. Eric finally spoke. You're making this dramatic. It's not about love, it's just money. Don't guilt trip them. That did it. I turned to face him fully. Easy for you to say. You get praised for sending wine baskets. I keep this house running and no one even notices. He opened his mouth to argue, but I didn't let him. You want to know what this is really about? It's about who gets to say no without consequences. You say no, you're busy. I say no, I'm a disappointment. No one said a word. I looked at my parents, my mother teary, my father stone-faced, and something inside me cracked. Maybe it's because I'm not your son. Maybe if I'd been born male, saying no wouldn't mean I'm ungrateful. Maybe I'd be someone to be proud of. The room froze. It hung there, heavy and unblinking, truth wrapped in acid. My mother looked away. My father's jaw tightened. Eric shifted uncomfortably, but stayed silent. That was the real betrayal, not just the money, not just the blame, but the silence. Because deep down, I knew they had seen me stretch myself thin, watched me bleed time and energy and care into this family, and they still sided with the illusion of the golden child. That night, I didn't stay for dinner. I left the groceries on the counter and walked out without saying goodbye. It wasn't a grand gesture, no slammed doors, no screaming, just a quiet act of self-preservation, the first of many. It started with a bounced check. I had mailed a donation to the Legal Aid Foundation, a small gesture I made every year around Thanksgiving. But that week, an email landed in my inbox, politely informing me the check had been returned due to insufficient funds. I blinked at the screen. That couldn't be right. I logged into my bank account and, sure enough, my balance was lower than it should have been. Again. But I'd just been paid the week before. Rent had cleared, groceries were accounted for, and I hadn't used my credit card all month. I sat at my desk, brows furrowed, retracing every withdrawal. That's when I noticed something strange. A recurring monthly transfer of $250, dated back years, tagged as Family Transfer Holding. It was a name I didn't recognize. The account number wasn't familiar either. I clicked deeper into the transaction history. More entries appeared. $400 here, $1,200 there, even a $3,000 lump sum from the year I'd cashed out my vacation payout, all labeled temporary reallocation. That term hit me like cold water. I remembered now. Dad had asked me years ago if he could use my bank details to hold some funds he didn't want to report jointly with Mom for tax reasons. I hadn't thought much of it. It sounded like something technical. Harmless. But this wasn't harmless. This was theft in disguise. I opened my email and typed the name of the unfamiliar account into the search bar. Bingo. An email from 4 years ago. Subject: investment account. Eric Rothschild Capital Ventures. It took a full minute for me to process what I was seeing. The family holding account was real, but it wasn't holding money for emergencies or property taxes or anything related to my parents' supposed needs. Number. It was linked to an LLC under Eric's name. Eric Rothschild Capital Ventures. I felt like I had been punched. I dug further, obsessively. There were PDF attachments, old scans of money transfers, casual back and forths between Dad and Eric about front-loading the next tranche, and even a line that read, "Lauren didn't even ask questions about the July transfer. Told you she wouldn't." My ears rang. It wasn't just that I had been sending money blindly to my parents out of guilt, loyalty, and misplaced hope. It was that they had used me, strategically, methodically, to fund him, the golden boy, the son who sent wine baskets and holiday cards while I stayed late in courtrooms and slept 3 hours a night. They didn't just prefer him, they invested in him. With my money. I stared at the screen long after the documents had closed. The cursor blinked at me like a silent metronome. In that moment, everything, every awkward phone call, every unpaid loan, every half smile from Dad when I shared good news, came flooding back, overlaid in painful clarity. I remembered law school, how I worked at the campus library in the evenings just to afford textbooks, while Eric's wedding was splashed across the society pages. Mom had called, gushing about the imported flowers and designer gown his wife wore. She didn't ask how I was eating that week. Then there was the year I almost bought a condo. I had finally saved enough for a down payment. Deceived my great. Even had the listing bookmarked. A small but sunny place near the park. My own first piece of the world. But just before signing, Dad had called, saying Mom needed surgery. Something about insurance delays. He sounded frantic. So I wired him the full amount. They never mentioned it again. When I asked about repayment 6 months later, he laughed. Still hung up on that? You make enough now. Just work a few extra cases. I never brought it up again. There were birthdays I missed. Not because I forgot, but because I couldn't afford the gas to drive out and the gift they expected. There were promotions that went unnoticed, holidays I spent alone, and endless weekends buried in briefs while Eric skied in Aspen. Still, I kept trying, because a part of me, deep down, believed that if I just did enough, gave enough, maybe, just maybe, I would be enough. I thought about the time I surprised them with new kitchen appliances. I maxed out my credit card, telling myself it was worth it to see them happy. Mom called that night. Eric says the oven's a little small for turkey season, but thanks anyway. I laughed back then, but it wasn't funny anymore. Not now, not after seeing the truth in numbers and receipts and account names. The depth of it all, it wasn't just betrayal, it was design. A system they built where I was the fallback plan, the secret fund, the afterthought, and I let them. I thought being a good daughter meant sacrificing without conditions, but the more I gave, the more invisible I became. I leaned back in my chair, blinking away the heat behind my eyes. I traded my financial safety for crumbs of approval, and they never came. That sentence lived in me now. It wasn't just a passing thought. It was a reckoning. And once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. The room was glowing with golden chandeliers and polished cutlery, laughter echoing off the high ceilings like a scripted sitcom. My mother had gone all out for this family dinner. There were hand-folded napkins, name cards, even floral arrangements imported from Santa Barbara. All for Eric. He arrived late, of course, like a celebrity making a red carpet entrance. Everyone clapped. I didn't. His wife kissed both my cheeks airily, then launched into a detailed breakdown of their new villa in Palm Springs. "We had the foyer redesigned to look like Santorini," she said. Eric thought it would feel more aspirational. I nodded, sipping water. My seat was near the end of the table, 2 chairs away from the kitchen. Eric was right across from Dad, prime spotlight. My chair felt like it belonged to the caterer. Dad raised his glass. His voice carried like a drum roll. "To the son who's given us pride," he beamed, looking right at Eric. "Our legacy, our hope, our joy." He didn't look at me. Then he added, chuckling, "And Lauren, still doing something with law, right?" Laughter. It wasn't cruel, not exactly, but it sliced clean. I smiled politely. I had learned to survive these dinners the way one survives an MRI. Stay still, breathe shallow, wait for the noise to end. But inside me, something had shifted. That day at the bank had pulled back the curtain. The documents I had printed now sat inside my leather folder tucked under my chair. I looked around the table. Uncles, cousins, family friends, all nodding along as if this performance was holy. No one noticed I hadn't laughed. No one noticed I was done pretending. Dessert was being served when he said it. Dad leaned back, wineglass in hand, and with the casual venom of a man who had repeated this line in his mind 100 times, he said, "Lauren, sweetheart, you really should stop exhausting yourself. You'll never be as good as your brother. Accept it." There was no smile this time. It wasn't said in jest. It was a statement, a verdict. Something shattered inside me. Not anger, no, something older, colder. Like the moment when a window finally cracks from years of silent pressure. The room fell quiet. Forks paused midair. Even Eric didn't smirk. I stood up slowly. There were no theatrics, no shouting, just my hands, calmly lifting the folder from beneath my seat, placing it on the center of the table. I opened it. "This," I said, "is a breakdown of every payment I've made for this family in the last 13 years. Eyes widened. I didn't wait for permission. "This one's for the roof repair. $5,000. Never reimbursed. Here's the hospital bill from Mom's fall. $3,400. Paid out of pocket. The property tax shortfall from 2020, $2,800. Birthday parties, prescriptions, groceries when Eric was traveling, all documented." Gasps. I turned to my father. "You say I'll never be as good as Eric? Then from now on, ask him to pay your bills." Silence. Thick, suffocating silence. Even the candles seemed to flicker differently. And for the first time in my life, I didn't shrink under it. I stood taller. I pulled out the itemized spreadsheet. "This is notarized," I said, voice steady. "It outlines the financial transactions from my account to both yours and Mom's over the past decade. I've included account statements, bank verifications, even the routing numbers. You'll notice some of these transfers were labeled as temporary loans. None were returned." Eric shifted in his seat. I continued. "There's also evidence that those funds were redirected to support Rothschild Capital Ventures, Eric's firm, which means not only was I funding your emergencies, I was financing his investments." I heard someone inhale sharply. Dad opened his mouth, but I lifted a hand. "I'm not here for apologies. I've created a family trust. Effective immediately, any future requests for financial support will go through that trust, with a formal contract, signed, dated, tracked." Mom looked like she might cry. "But sweetheart," she whispered, "why didn't you say anything sooner?" I looked her straight in the eye. "I did." Pause. "But you didn't hear me, or Or maybe you didn't want to. Eric cleared his throat. Lauren, I didn't know Dad was using your... You knew enough, I interrupted. You signed the LLC registration. You had access to the disbursement reports. You were CC'd in the emails. Don't play dumb. He went silent. For once, nobody had a comeback, not even Dad. I reached into the folder one last time and pulled out a printed photo. It was of me, age 12, holding up a blue ribbon for a statewide art contest. In the background, Dad's hand was on Eric's shoulder. That photo had never made it to the hallway wall. I laid it on the table. Just a reminder, I said softly. I've always been here. You just never looked. Then I sat down, calmly, and took a bite of my untouched cake. The morning after the dinner, I woke up earlier than usual. Not because I had somewhere to be, but because I couldn't sleep past the weight that had lifted off me. For the first time in years, my body didn't feel like it was dragging someone else's expectations with it. I made coffee, black, no sugar, sat at my kitchen table, listened to the hum of nothing. It was peaceful, not triumphant, just quiet. Then my phone rang. It was Eric. I stared at the screen for a second longer than necessary, then answered. Hey, he said, his voice unusually soft. Can we talk? I waited. I didn't know, Lauren, I swear. About the money, about how much you've been covering. Dad never said anything. I assumed they were fine. I stayed silent. He continued. I looked at the documents after you left. Everything was there. I'm sorry. Truly. There was a pause. I'd like to pay you back my share, maybe even set up a system with the trust you mentioned to cover their future expenses. You shouldn't have done this alone. That surprised me, not the guilt, but the offer, the ownership. Okay, I said simply. Another pause. Then he added, you were right. And brave. I never saw it until now. That one hit a little deeper than I expected. After we hung up, I stared at my coffee. It had gone cold, but for once, I didn't feel the need to reheat it. A few hours later, a text came in. It was from my mother. I opened it with the kind of caution one reserves for old boxes in attics, curiosity laced with dread. Lauren, I've been thinking, last night, I saw you, really saw you, and I want you to know you were brave. You've always been strong. I'm sorry it took me this long to say it. I read it twice, then 3 times. It wasn't an apology. Not exactly. But it was something, the first kind word from her that didn't follow a crisis or a condition. I didn't reply immediately. I just let it sit there, like a rare flower blooming in winter, unfamiliar, fragile. But Dad said nothing. No call, no text, no acknowledgement. Part of me had expected that, or maybe just accepted it long before. I realized something in that silence. I no longer needed his validation. It didn't mean I didn't want it, but I wasn't anchored to it anymore. He had shaped so much of how I measured myself, by what he praised, what he dismissed. For decades, I had tried to earn his approval like a dog chasing a car it could never catch. But now I had turned inward, built my own compass, one that didn't bend toward his voice. That night, I lit a candle, not for mourning, but for intention. I wrote in my journal, I showed up for myself. And that will always be enough. I still didn't know what would happen next. Would the family fracture? Would we drift further? Would Dad ever speak? Maybe. Maybe not. But I knew one thing. I wasn't the same Lauren who swallowed insults and smiled. I was the Lauren who stood up and said, then let him pay your bills. And silence, this time, didn't feel like defeat. It felt like space, a beginning. 2 months after that night, I signed a lease for a small office space in the Arts District. Exposed brick, 2nd floor, a view of the coffee shop across the street. I named it Equitas Legal Consulting. Just me, a paralegal I'd trained at the labor rights nonprofit, and a mission to help women navigate financial abuse and reclaim their autonomy, something I wished I had learned to do years ago. It didn't come with billboards or praise from my father, but it came with purpose. My first client was a single mother in her 50s whose husband had drained their shared account to invest in crypto behind her back. She came in defeated. She walked out knowing her rights, ready to fight. I saw myself in her. Every time I helped someone untangle the legal knots of manipulation and control, I felt like I was also freeing pieces of my former self. Lauren the fixer, Lauren the silent giver, Lauren the less than. I also started dating again. His name was Mark, a high school English teacher who coached baseball on weekends and had no idea who Eric was. I didn't have to hide what I did or dim my light to keep things smooth. When I told him about my job, about the trust I'd set up for my parents, about the family dinner, he said, "That sounds like the kind of strength most people only dream of having." He didn't look intimidated. He looked impressed. And I didn't shrink. I smiled. For once, I wasn't choosing between love and being fully myself. Then came another family dinner. It was Eric's birthday this time. Low-key, just immediate family, home-cooked meal. I debated whether to go. Part of me still flinched at the idea of sitting at that same dining table. But I went. Not out of duty, not because I felt guilty, but because I knew I could. This time, I arrived last, not early to help. I brought a bottle of wine and nothing else. No emotional armor, no ledgers to settle. Just me. We sat around the same table. My dad was quieter than usual. My mother smiled politely. Eric welcomed me with a casual, "Glad you came." During dinner, someone asked about work, and I didn't minimize it. I recently won a case for a woman whose ex-husband forged her signature on a mortgage, I said, cutting into my chicken. She thought she had no power. Now she owns her home outright. No one interrupted. No one deflected. They listened, even Dad. For a moment, I caught him looking at me, not with warmth exactly, but with something close to recognition. Like he was seeing a version of me he hadn't bothered to understand before. I didn't need him to clap. I didn't need applause. I just needed that silence. Because in that pause, in that small space of attention, I realized something. I'd finally stopped performing. I wasn't proving anymore. I wasn't chasing anymore. I was simply living. And they could either see it or not. Either way, I was done living for borrowed praise. I drove home that night, music low, windows cracked open. The streetlights streaked across my windshield like quiet affirmations. This was my life. And for the first time, it felt entirely mine. It was late afternoon. The light filtered through the blinds of my new office, casting long stripes across the hardwood floor. My coffee had gone cold, untouched for over an hour. I was reviewing a case file when the knock came, soft, hesitant. I looked up. It was my father. He stood in the doorway like someone who wasn't sure if they belonged there. No tie, just a windbreaker. His hair thinner than I remembered. He looked older than I'd ever seen him. "Do you have a minute?" he asked, eyes fixed on the floor. I gestured to the chair across from my desk. "Of course." He sat down, exhaled long and slow, hands resting awkwardly on his knees. There was a long silence. Finally, he said, "I drove past here twice before I came in." I smiled gently, but didn't say anything. He needed the space to find his words. "I've been thinking about that night. The dinner." I nodded, still quiet. "I wasn't fair," he said. "I looked at Eric and saw potential. I looked at you and I guess I just assumed you didn't need the praise. You handled everything so well, so quietly." He paused, then added more softly, "I was wrong. Not everyone who stays silent is weak, and not everyone who handles things quietly is okay." The words hung in the air like fragile glass. I felt something shift in me, not a surge of triumph, not vindication, just release. I looked at him, really looked. He wasn't the towering figure from my childhood anymore. He was just a man, flawed, aging, trying, perhaps too late, but trying nonetheless. "You don't have to apologize," I said, voice steady. "I don't need that." He looked startled, confused. I leaned forward slightly. What I needed was to be seen, just seen, not compared, not judged, just known for who I am. He nodded. "I'm trying." "I know." Another silence followed, but it wasn't tense. It was quiet in a good way. Peaceful, almost. He stood up slowly. "You did well here," he said, glancing around the office. "It's impressive." "Thank you." He looked like he wanted to say something more, but instead he nodded once and turned to leave. As he reached the door, I said, "Dad?" He turned back. "I forgive you." He swallowed hard. "I'm not sure I deserve that." "Maybe not," I said, smiling. "But forgiveness isn't about deserving, it's about setting myself free." He nodded again, and this time there was something softer in his face. Then he left. I sat there for a while, letting the quiet settle around me. I didn't cry. I didn't feel broken. I felt whole. And that's when I realized forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It doesn't erase the years of silence or the sleepless nights or the ache of not being enough, but it means I get to walk forward without dragging it all behind me. It means I get to choose peace over pain. It means I finally get to live as me. Before we say goodbye, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Is it a quiet morning with a warm cup of coffee, or a late night where stories like this keep you company? Let me know in the comments. I read everyone with gratitude, and if this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing to the channel, not just to hear more stories like mine, but to be part of a community that still believes in kindness, healing, and second chances. Thank you for spending your time with us today. Wherever you are, I hope you carry this story with you, and remember, sometimes the miracle doesn't knock on your door. It waits quietly until you're ready to open your heart. Take care, and I'll see you in the next story.